Acceptance would raise the issue of status confessionis for many of us. Acceptance would constitute a frontal assault on the core meanings and values of the Christian faith. Acceptance would involve a denial of the basics of the Trinitarian faith, not just a difference of opinion. Acceptance would mean a rejection of the commandments of God, and that cannot be tolerated. There is a good deal of pessimism that the ELCA will accept these proposals. For all the reasons I've already enumerated, that pessimism is well-founded. We have the memory of the ELCA's first incredible effort at making a statement on sexuality. It was a perfect product of the forces I described above. After the fallout from that debacle, I was miraculously appointed to an ELCA task force to deliberate about how the ELCA might deliberate about sexuality issues. I found that I was the only one on the task force of about a dozen willing to speak for the traditional teaching on these matters. The general assumption of the vocal majority, there were a lot of people that kept their heads down, the vocal majority was that all the issues had been settled in their mind. It was time to enlighten the minions of darkness in the ELCA. The host of materials and actions of many ELCA organs that have followed have reinforced the perception that the mind of the ELCA is indeed made up. All that remains is the coup d'etat of 2005. The new task force has been appointed. It's pretty well stacked according to the ELCA LPD. But we should not give up prematurely, and we're not. A genuine theological dialogue in the task force and in the church in general may well emerge as we draw nearer to 2005. And we need to make our own contribution to that dialogue in the time we have left. That's my assessment of the situation. Number two, I should call this the argument for the tradition, not the traditional argument. The argument for the tradition. I've experienced an almost providential confluence of tasks in the last several weeks. I've been writing my revised chapter on marriage and family life for a second edition of Ordinary Saints. At the same time, I was preparing this lecture. What could be better, I thought, than trying out on this assembly my effort at grappling with the issues of homosexuality in my new edition. So I'm going to do that. The chapter on marriage and family is the second longest in the book. I spent 20 pages outlining the Lutheran teaching on marriage, which is pivotal for grappling with all the related issues, including homosexuality. But I can't do both marriage and my section on homosexuality. So I deal with marriage as a social institution of the Lesham Kingdom, as well as a holy estate instituted by God for Christians in the church. I differentiate sharply the Christian convictions about the scope, time frame, and substance of the holy covenant of marriage from the debased views emerging from the culture. I then take up related issues. One of them is the case for sexual abstinence before marriage and sexual fidelity within marriage. Other issues are abortion, pornography, and equality within marriage. The section on homosexuality follows the main discussion of marriage, and I want to share that with you. I break it into normative issues, which I feel more confident about than I do the pastoral issues, which I'm going to discuss later. I'll defer to some of your wisdom on pastoral issues. The Jewish and Christian traditions have been opposed to homosexual sexual relations, though not always in a punitive fashion. Their prohibitions follow from their belief that there is a divinely created structure to sexual life. Women and men are meant to complement each other. They fit together physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Male and female, God created them. They are meant to be as one within the bonds of marriage. In other words, there is form to the creation. Moral sexual relations are appropriate to form. This consideration rejects sexual activities between adults and children, between humans and animals, between family members, between persons of the same sex. The Ten Commandments assume and order such a normative form. This negative posture remains intact among the vast majority of Jewish and Christian traditions, despite strong attacks on it from some secular authorities in legal, medical, psychological, and social scientific fields, as well as challenges from a number of Christian scholars, Christian advocacy groups. Last night we heard Mert Stroman tell us about those various groups that prevent any kind of fair-minded discussion and how they indeed affect the conversation in the church. Indeed, the challenges from within mainstream Christian denominations have been so sharp and relentless that they threaten to split them. The controversy is a very serious one with both sides, the traditionalists and revisionists, holding fiercely to their positions. A large group in the middle does not know what to think. They're confused. The gist of the revisionist argument contends that there really is no persisting discernible sexual identity tied to the obvious differences in biological form. Traditional differences, they argue, are oppressive cultural definitions imposed by heterosexual males that have proven to be highly relative, both from culture to culture and from person to person within a culture. Thus, they counsel that love between persons be the sole criterion governing sexual relations. As far as I understand, that's the center of their argument. All you need is love. The appropriate to form qualification should be dropped, at least as it pertains to homosexual relations. Homosexual relations are not, for these revisionists, disordered or imperfect, only different. There is less interest in dropping the appropriate to form qualification with regard to incest, pedophilia, and bestiality, though it is difficult to see why these barriers should not also fall, given their argument. Nevertheless, those responsible for Christian moral tradition are not convinced. Neither is this writer. The biblical position seems fairly clear and straightforward in spite of the efforts to relativize it through historical critical studies. At least 2 of the 10 commandments assume the heterosexual nature of the marriage bond, as do the creation stories in Genesis. The whole structure of the Bible is heterosexual. The revisionists bear this out by calling it heterosexist. Church tradition is rather unequivocal. There's nothing in either the Bible or Christian teaching that can be retrieved to legitimate homosexual relations, as there were with the issues of slavery and women's leadership in the church. The revisionists are now even admitting that one cannot make a case for legitimating homosexual unions on the basis of the Bible or the tradition. And we have a great deal to give you, Rob, thanks for in terms of a definitive writing summarizing all these things and kind of squelching all that revisionist banter, although it'll pop up its head again. I think in many at the highest level this has kind of been solved. So they're thrown back upon other sorts of arguments to legitimate homosexual relations. I'll skip the next paragraph. No, I won't. Besides the Bible and Christian tradition, human experience seems to suggest that sexual identity has deep rootage in persisting biological form. The tendency of cultures to differentiate clearly between male and female sexual identities indicates a continuing bias toward complementary sexual identities and roles. These cultures prize childbearing and raising with stable unions of male and female. There is scarcely any warrant, therefore, for abandoning the appropriate to form requirement, neither for Christians in general, nor especially for the leadership of the church. Churches must confidently and clearly teach the normative Christian moral tradition, teaching on these matters that has been in place for thousands of years. Overturning the tradition's moral presumption against homosexual relations would take far more evidence, far stronger arguments against it than we have now. That's my normative section. And now I move to pastoral issues. This does not mean, however, that the church cannot have a nuanced and compassionate approach to homosexuals. Without relaxing its affirmation of heterosexual sex within the marriage covenant, the church can strongly insist that the gospel is addressed to all sinners. Homosexual activity is not some especially heinous sin that cuts one off from God's grace. Consistent with this, inclusion within the church and its pastoral care should be insisted on. As with all sin, though, forgiveness follows repentance and leads to efforts to follow God's will insofar as it is discerned by the church. The church should continue to call those who are homosexual by orientation, derived from either biological and environmental factors, to a heroic response. And I put heroic in there in quotation marks only to suggest that it's heroic in terms of the current culture. It's not, historically speaking, been all that heroic, but in this culture, this sex-drenched culture, it does seem to be heroic. The church has long honored such heroic responses for homosexual and heterosexual singles alike, and should continue to do so. Indeed, such a response should be the only one allowed for ordained clergy who have vowed to exemplify the ideals of the church.